Every generation swears they had it harder. Every generation is convinced the ones before them had it easier, and the ones after them have it softer. Boomers say millennials are entitled. Millennials say boomers rigged the system. Gen Z watches the argument unfold on their phones, documenting it in real time. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to admit. This isn't a generational war. It's an economic reckoning playing out across a single family tree. Same bloodline, different decades, different rules, and radically different outcomes. We throw around labels like their diagnoses. Okay, boomer, snowflake, lazy, out of touch. Each phrase designed to shut down the conversation instead of deepen it. But if you zoom out, if you strip away the memes and the headlines, you start to see something far more serious. The tension between boomers, millennials, and Gen Z isn't about personality flaws. It's about structural shifts in economics, technology, and power. These aren't character defects, they're adaptations to different worlds. Let's start with who we're actually talking about. Baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, came of age in the shadow of World War II, during one of the greatest economic expansions in American and Western history. Manufacturing was strong. Unions had leverage. A high school diploma could land you a stable, middle-class job. A single income could buy a home, raise children, and fund retirement. That wasn't nostalgia. That was math. Millennials, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, were told to follow that same blueprint. Study hard, go to college, take on debt if you must because education is the ticket. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit like a wrecking ball. They graduated into hiring freezes, collapsing banks, and an economy that had quietly shifted from pensions to 401ks, from loyalty to layoffs. The rules hadn't just changed, they had expired. Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2012, never experienced a world without smartphones. They grew up during endless wars, climate anxiety, political polarization, and the aftershocks of economic instability. Before many of them could vote, they had already witnessed a pandemic shut down the global economy. Their worldview wasn't shaped by prosperity or even by broken promises. It was shaped by volatility. When a boomer says, "If you work hard, you'll succeed," they're not necessarily being dismissive. They're describing a system that once functioned that way. When a millennial responds with skepticism, they're not being cynical for sport. They watched institutions, banks, corporations, even governments fail spectacularly. And when Gen Z expresses anxiety about the future, it's not fragility. It's a rational response to rising housing costs, student debt, and the planet under stress. Consider housing alone. In 1970, the median home price in the United States hovered around 2 to 3 times the median annual income. Today, in many major cities across the US, UK, and Canada, that ratio has ballooned to 5, 6, even 8 times income. That's not about avocado toast. That's about arithmetic. You can't budget your way out of a structural imbalance. Boomers often stayed at one company for decades because it paid to do so. There were pensions, healthcare was tied to long-term employment, loyalty had a return on investment. Millennials watched their parents dedicate 25 or 30 years to firms that downsized them with a single email. So they diversified skills, hopped jobs, built side hustles. Gen Z watched millennials burn out chasing hustle culture and decided maybe work shouldn't consume their identity at all. What some call quiet quitting is often just a recalibration of boundaries in a system that no longer guarantees reciprocity. Technology widened the divide even further. Boomers adapted to technology as it arrived: television, personal computers, the internet. Millennials grew up alongside it, bridging analog childhoods with digital adulthoods. Gen Z didn't adopt technology, they were born into it. Their social lives, news cycles, and even job prospects are mediated through algorithms. Of course, they process information differently, their cognitive environment is different. We mock boomers for struggling with apps. We mock Gen Z for struggling with cursive. But competence is contextual. every generation becomes fluent in the tools their survival requires. Technology fluency isn't intelligence, it's timing. Then there's money, not just how much of it exists, but what it represents. For many boomers, success had a clear blueprint: stable career, homeownership, marriage, retirement with dignity. It was linear, predictable, measurable. Millennials inherited that script only to discover the stage had changed. For them, success often became about flexibility, experiences, and meaningful work because traditional milestones were delayed or financially out of reach. Gen Z is redefining success again, leaning into entrepreneurship, personal branding, and authenticity. In a world where institutions feel fragile, building something portable, a brand, a skill set, an audience, feels safer than trusting a single employer. But beneath these shifting definitions lies the same core desire: security, purpose, connection. Boomers optimized for security because it was attainable. Millennials chased purpose because security felt unstable. Gen Z seeks authenticity because both security and purpose seem uncertain without it. Even communication styles reflect economic and technological shifts. Boomers prefer phone calls because that once signaled seriousness and respect. Millennials prefer texts and emails because efficiency became survival in a multitasking, always-on economy. Gen Z communicates through short-form video, memes, and voice notes because nuance travels faster in layered digital formats. No one is wrong. They're optimized for different environments. Mental health may be the most profound shift of all. For many boomers, emotional struggles were private matters. You pushed through. Therapy was stigmatized. Millennials began naming burnout, anxiety, and depression, often after silently enduring them. Gen Z speaks about mental health openly and publicly. Some interpret that as weakness. It's not. It's transparency shaped by a culture that values visibility. The pain didn't suddenly appear, the vocabulary did. And here's what rarely gets said out loud. All three generations are afraid. Boomers fear outliving their savings in an era of rising healthcare costs. Millennials fear never fully catching up, never building the wealth their parents did. Gen Z fears that even if they save diligently, systemic instability, economic, political, environmental, could undermine it all. Different timelines, same underlying anxiety. Will I be secure? All three want meaningful work. All three care about family, whether biological or chosen. All three fear irrelevance. Boomers don't want to be dismissed as outdated. Millennials don't want to be perpetually infantilized. Gen Z doesn't want to be written off as naive before they had a chance to lead. Here's the real plot twist. The loudest generational conflicts often mask deeper systemic issues: wage stagnation, housing shortages, automation, globalization. These forces don't belong to one generation. They are macroeconomic realities. It's easier to blame another generation than to confront structural change. It's easier to argue about work ethic than to analyze productivity gains that didn't translate into proportional wage growth. It's easier to mock TikTok than to question why traditional career ladders feel increasingly unstable. And remember this: boomers weren't always the establishment. They were once the rebels, the protesters, the disruptors challenging authority in the 60s and 70s. Millennials were once the kids these days. Now many are parents, managers, policymakers. Gen Z will age too. One day they'll hear a younger generation say, "You don't get it." The cycle will continue. The question is whether we let that cycle divide us or educate us. Because when you strip away the stereotypes, you see something deeply human. Every generation is doing the best it can with the hand it was dealt. Boomers didn't design globalization alone. Millennials didn't invent social media algorithms. Gen Z didn't create the national debt or climate instability. They inherited conditions and adapted. Same humans, different histories, one shared future. And if that future is going to be stable, economically, socially, geopolitically, it won't be because one generation won the argument. It'll be because they finally understood each other well enough to build something better together. So I want you to think about this the next time you hear a dismissive label thrown around.
Ask yourself, is this really about character or is it about context? Is this frustration personal or structural? If this conversation challenged your assumptions even a little, then don't just scroll past. Share your perspective in the comments. Tell me which generation you belong to and what you think the others misunderstand about you. Subscribe if you want more deep, honest breakdowns of the economic and geopolitical forces shaping our lives. Because the real debate isn't boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z. It's whether we choose division or understanding in the face of change that affects us all.